Imagine this. You're alone on a dark highway, miles from civilization. The night is thick, impenetrable, and your car, a lifeline to safety, has given up on you. The road stretches endlessly ahead and behind, but there's no sign of another soul. You're stranded, exposed, and vulnerable. Then, through the haze of rain, you see it, a flicker of neon, the promise of shelter. Relief washes over you. But relief is fleeting. You approach the building, a roadside motel, the kind where time stands still. Faded paint clings to walls that have seen too many storms, and a cracked vacancy sign hums faintly in the downpour. It's your only option. What choice do you have? You step inside, greeted by the flicker of fluorescent lights and the slow, deliberate gaze of the man behind the desk. He hands you a key, but not before hesitating, his eyes fixed on you with an intensity that makes your stomach tighten. And then the warning. Room 13 isn't safe. A simple statement. No elaboration. Just the key in your hand and the weight of his words pressing down on you. Would you stay? Would you risk it? What choice would you have, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with the storm outside raging harder every second? Emma didn't have a choice. Room 13 was her only refuge. But what she found inside wasn't rest or safety. It was something far more unsettling, something that would trap her in a nightmarish loop, pulling her deeper into a story that began long before she arrived. A story written in whispers and shadows, and in the final desperate words of those who came before her. What unfolded that night in Room 13 wasn't just a story. It was a warning, and now you're about to hear it. But as you listen, remember this. Every choice has a consequence, and some doors should never be opened. Emma sat behind the wheel, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as the engine sputtered and died once again. The car's faint lights flickered before shutting off completely, plunging her into darkness. Alone, stranded miles away from the nearest town, her phone's battery had long since given up, and the storm was worsening by the minute. There were no other cars, no houses in sight. Just an endless stretch of road, a monotonous horizon swallowed by the night. She stepped out into the storm, her coat barely enough to shield her from the biting cold. The rain was relentless, pouring from the sky like a heavy curtain. But in the distance, she spotted it, a light flickering from an old, weary building. The faded sign above it read Motel, Vacancy, and beneath the flashing light, a narrow, damp path led toward it. Her footsteps echoed inside the lobby as she crossed the threshold, the smell of damp wood and old carpet greeting her. The air inside was thick, almost stale, like it hadn't been disturbed for years. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s, graying hair, tired eyes, looked up at her. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and something about his eyes sent a chill down her spine. He didn't smile. Instead, he spoke with a gravely voice, almost as if he was warning her without words. Room 13? It's not safe, but it's all we have left. Stay if you must, he said. Emma blinked. Was it a warning or a plea? She could see the unease in his eyes, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he slid the key across the counter. It was old, the metal tarnished, its number, 13, barely visible beneath years of wear. For a moment, she hesitated. Something in the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken history. But then, The logical part of her mind took over. A motel was just a motel, right? A place to sleep. A brief stop on her long, unplanned detour. She took the key, dismissing his words as superstition, just a strange old man, perhaps a little too attached to an old tale. After all, it was just a room, just a bed for the night. The rain was relentless, and the storm outside was too fierce to risk driving further into the night. She needed rest, and room 13, it would have to do. She stepped down the narrow hallway toward room 13. The floorboards groaned underfoot, echoing through the silence. As she walked, her eyes were drawn to the flickering light above her, its hum growing louder with each step. It buzzed and sputtered, like it was on the verge of giving out entirely. She paused, looking up at the old, worn light, wondering for a moment if it was malfunctioning or if it was something else. The door to room 13 seemed oddly old even for a motel. The paint was chipped and peeling, revealing the wood beneath, warped and discolored by years of exposure. And the number 13 barely visible, as if it had been scrubbed clean countless times, only to reappear stubborn and defiant. Emma felt a sudden unease, but she shook it off. It was just her imagination. Inside, the room was small and dim. A single bed, its blankets faded and worn, a wooden dresser, and a small window covered by thick, dark curtains. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The quiet was unsettling. The silence was thick, pressing in on her. But there was no turning back. The rain outside beat relentlessly against the window, and with a sigh, Emma threw her bag onto the bed. She moved to the window and pulled the curtains back, revealing the storm that raged outside. The wind howled as if angry, the rain streaking down the glass like tears. But the sound, the howling wind, the distant thunder, it all seemed to fade into the background as something else crept in. A strange, oppressive feeling, hanging in the air. She couldn't quite place it, but it felt like she was being watched. She shrugged it off, reminding herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. She was tired. She needed sleep. But as she settled onto the bed, something strange happened. The room, once just a place to sleep, now felt wrong. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the lamp by the bed. Flicking the switch, the light flickered for a moment before turning on, casting long shadows on the walls. But there in the shadows, just at the corner of her vision, she saw it. A shape, fleeting, almost imperceptible, moving along the wall. She blinked. It was gone. Just the shadows. Just her mind playing tricks again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was there just out of sight, something waiting, watching. And then, just as she was about to shake it off, the door creaked open slightly, as if on its own. But there was no one there, only the whisper of the wind, and the odd, unsettling stillness that filled the room. Emma had made her decision. She would stay in room 13, no matter how strange it felt. But little did she know, the night had only just begun. Room 13. Ordinary at first glance. A modest bed, a small wooden desk, curtains thin enough to let the faintest outline of rain-soaked trees press against the window. It was just another motel room, Emma thought. And yet, something about it felt incomplete, like it was waiting for her to notice what was wrong. The room was colder than she expected, the air thick with a damp chill that seemed to settle in her bones. As she set her bag on the desk, her eyes caught something unusual. A journal. Its leather cover was worn, the edges of its pages yellowed, as if it had been there for years. It sat alone on the bedside table, unassuming, yet demanding attention. She opened it, the pages brittle under her fingers. The handwriting inside was frantic, scrawled as if by someone in a hurry or in fear. The words leapt off the page, jumbled thoughts written by someone desperate to be heard. "I am being watched," one line read, underlined so many times the paper had nearly torn. "The walls," they whisper. Emma paused, her breath catching in her throat. It was absurd, wasn't it? Just the ramblings of a previous guest who'd spent too much time alone in a motel room. But as she read further, Emma began to feel the words weren't just written. They were etched into the air around her. The journal described things that felt too close to home. A flickering light that wouldn't stay still. Whispers so faint they seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Emma glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. Even the rain outside seemed muffled now, as though the world had drawn back to leave her alone in that moment. She looked up at the single bulb overhead. It flickered, casting shadows that stretched and moved unnaturally, as though the light itself was trying to warn her. Her pulse quickened, and she forced herself to look back at the journal. The entries were chaotic, fragmented. They spoke of footsteps in the night, of a voice calling her name. Emma shivered. How could the writer know her name? Emma closed the journal, her hands trembling. She told herself it was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the strangeness of her surroundings. But then she heard it. A sound so faint she wasn't sure if it was real. A whisper, soft and fleeting, like breath brushing against her ear. Her heart raced as she turned her head, searching for the source of the sound. The room was empty, as it had been moments before. Yet the whisper lingered, its presence undeniable. She stood, pacing the small room, trying to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The flickering light above her buzzed, casting erratic patterns on the walls. She tried to distract herself, unpacking her things and turning on the small television. Static greeted her, the screen crackling as though it couldn't quite find a signal. Frustrated, she turned it off and sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. And then she saw it, the clock on the wall, its hands ticking closer to midnight. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to loom, its rhythmic ticking echoing through the room. The journal's words came rushing back to her. Midnight. It had mentioned midnight. They come when the clock strikes 12. One line had said. Emma's breath quickened as she glanced at the clock again. Just 1 minute to go. The whispers grew louder now, no longer faint, but insistent, pressing against her from all sides. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her eyes darting between the clock and the flickering light. The whispers grew into a cacophony, a storm of voices she couldn't escape. The clock struck 12, its chime cutting through the noise like a knife. And then everything went dark. Emma stood there, shrouded in darkness. Her breath was the only sound now, ragged and quick. And then, just when she thought she was alone, a voice. Clear, cold, and right behind her, the room felt alive. The air thick with a presence she couldn't see, but could feel in every corner. Her scream was swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Emma clutched the journal tightly, her fingers digging into its brittle cover. She sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through its pages with growing urgency. What she had dismissed as random scribbles earlier now felt deliberate, calculated. Each entry described events she had experienced since stepping into room 13. The whispers, the flickering light, the clock ticking toward midnight. Every detail was there, as though the journal was writing her night before it happened. Her pulse quickened when she turned to the final page. At first, it appeared blank, but as she tilted it toward the flickering light, faint letters emerged, written in what looked like smudged ink, or something darker. Her breath hitched as she read the final entry. One line, one name. It was her name, Emma, written in trembling letters. Below it, a date. Tomorrow. The journal wasn't recording the past. It was documenting the future. Her future. The pages trembled in her hands as the realization set in. This wasn't just someone else's nightmare. It was hers now. Emma threw the journal onto the bed, her mind racing. She needed to leave. Now. But as she turned toward the door, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping like 100 voices speaking at once. The sound pressed against her ears, making it hard to think. She reached for the doorknob, yanking it with all her strength. It didn't budge. Her panic grew as she pounded on the door, calling for help. But the hallway outside was silent, empty. She turned toward the window, her last hope. Grabbing the bedside lamp, she swung it with all her might, shattering the glass. The cold night air rushed in, cutting through the stifling tension of the room. Emma leaned out, expecting to see the rain-soaked parking lot. Instead, there was nothing. No ground, no trees, just an endless, swirling void, stretching out as far as she could see. The motel, it seemed, existed in its own realm, detached from the world she knew. Her last shred of hope vanished as the realization struck her. There was no escape. Behind her, the whispers intensified, now forming a single voice that called her name. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed darker, the flickering light barely illuminating the edges of her vision. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, faint at first, like smoke curling into shape. Its presence was undeniable, though it didn't move like something alive. It hovered, its form shifting between solid and spectral. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a sound but a presence, filling the room like a storm about to break. The figure extended a translucent hand, and the room seemed to shudder in response. Emma staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps. The voice continued, unrelenting. This room, it said, is a prison, a loop. Those who enter become its story, their lives written into its walls. And now, Emma, it's your turn. Emma screamed, throwing herself toward the door, clawing at it with all her strength. The room seemed alive now, the walls trembling, the air thick with a force she couldn't see but could feel pressing against her. She turned back to the figure, but it was gone. In its place, the journal lay open on the floor, its pages flipping on their own, faster and faster. Her eyes locked onto the final page, now filled with words she hadn't seen before. It described her every action, the panic, the shattered window, the endless void. The final line stood out, written in bold, jagged letters. It always ends the same. Emma fell to her knees, her strength drained. The whispers stopped. The room stilled. But the clock on the wall continued ticking, its hands moving backward now. undoing time. As her vision blurred, she realized the truth. Room 13 wasn't just a place. It was a story, and she was its newest chapter. If anyone's listening, if anyone can hear me, don't stay here. Please, don't make my mistake. Don't take room 13. Emma crouched in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the cold wall. Her voice trembled as she spoke into the void, uncertain if anyone could even hear her, or if her words would matter. I thought it was just a stupid superstition, just a warning from some old man too wrapped up in his own fears. But it wasn't. It wasn't. There's something here. Something wrong. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if this place is alive, but it's watching me. I can feel it. Every second I'm here, it's closer. It's waiting for something, and I don't know what. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything familiar, anything real. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages eerily still now, as though mocking her. She reached for it, her hands trembling, her voice cracking as she read aloud. It always ends the same. What does that mean? What does it want from me? The sound froze her in place. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the weight behind them, a presence that didn't belong. Emma pressed herself harder against the wall, gripping the journal like it was her only tether to reality. Please, I just want to go home. I just want this to end. Someone help me, please. Her mind raced, fragments of memories flashing before her eyes. The rain-soaked highway, the flickering sign, the manager's warning. Why hadn't she listened? Why did she think she could outsmart whatever this was? If you're still listening, if this is reaching anyone, don't come here. Don't stop at this motel. Don't take this room. It's a trap. It knows you before you even arrive. It's waiting for you, just like it waited for me. The room was plunged into darkness again, but this time it felt different. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Emma clutched her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as her whispers turned to desperate prayers. I don't want to die here. Please, someone, anyone. But there was no answer. Just the room watching, waiting, feeding on her fear. And in the silence, Emma realized one truth. No one escapes room 13. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter, the air thick with something unseen but inescapable. And then it came. No. Stay back. Please don't. The figure emerged from the shadows, not walking, but gliding, its edges blurring as though reality itself struggled to contain it. Its face was featureless, a void where its eyes should be. Yet Emma could feel its gaze piercing her. Please, I'll leave. I'll leave. Just let me go. But the room had no intention of letting her go. It never had. And then nothing. The rain had stopped by the time the next guest arrived. A man in his mid-30s, tired from a long drive, stepped into the lobby, dripping water onto the floor. The manager watched him closely, the faintest twitch of a smile crossing his lips. We've got one room left. Room 13. Will that be fine? He spoke. And just like that, the cycle began again. Room 13 claimed another. Room 13 remains. It waits for its next visitor. It waits for you. Would you take the key? Now you've heard the story of Room 13, a place where time bends, reality distorts, and the shadows seem alive. But what about you? What would you do if you were in Emma's shoes? Would you have ignored the manager's warning? Would you have dared to turn the key? Or would you have left, driving into the night, hoping never to look back? Perhaps you've experienced something unexplainable. A cold draft where no window was open. A voice when no one else was around. Have you ever felt watched when you were completely alone? These moments, fleeting and strange, linger in the corners of our memories. We want to hear your stories. Share your experiences in the comments below. Who knows? Your tale might hold the key to unlocking the mysteries of places like Room 13. And what do you think happens to those who stay in Room 13? Do they escape? Or do they become a part of its dark, endless story? Leave your theories in the comments. Let's unravel the secrets of Room 13 together. If you dare, if you found yourself gripping the edge of your seat tonight, don't forget to subscribe. There are more terrifying tales waiting for you. Stories of haunted places, cursed objects, and the unexplainable lurking just out of sight. We'll see you next time. Sleep well if you can,